Part 4, Forbidden Longing. The evening sun cast a warm glow over the ancient stone church, its stained glass windows glimmering like jewels. Sister Lucia stood outside, her rosary beads clutched in her hands as she gazed up at the towering spire. The tranquility of the moment was shattered by the familiar sound of a motorcycle engine roaring down the winding road. Lucia's heart raced as she watched Damien pull up to the church, his rugged features softened by the fading light. He dismounted the bike, his eyes immediately seeking hers. A silent understanding passed between them, an unspoken connection that had been growing stronger with each of his visits. Lucia felt a flutter of anticipation as Damien approached her, his steps deliberate and measured. She knew she should retreat to the sanctuary of the church and the safety of her vows, but something held her in place, drawn to the vulnerability she saw in his eyes.
Sister Lucia,
Damien said, his voice low and gentle.
I'm glad you're out here. I was hoping to see you.
Lucia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the rosary beads.
Damien, you shouldn't be here. This is a sacred place.
I know.
He replied, his gaze unwavering.
But it's also a place where I've found peace. And where I've found you.
Lucia felt the weight of his words, the unspoken longing that hung in the air between them. She knew she should turn away, to retreat behind the walls of her faith, but something deep within her yearned to bridge the distance that separated them. Slowly, Damien reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against the soft skin of her hand. Lucia felt a jolt of electricity at his touch, her breath catching in her throat. She should have pulled away, but instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. They stood there, under the canopy of a large oak tree, the world around them fading away. Lucia could feel the heat of Damien's body, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. She ached to close the distance between them, to feel the comfort of his embrace.
Lucia,
Damien whispered, his voice barely audible.
I know this is wrong, that I have no right to feel this way. But I can't stop thinking about you. You're the only one who's ever made me feel like I could be more than just a lost soul.
Lucia's eyes glistened with unshed tears.
Damien, I don't know what to say. My vows, my faith, they mean everything to me.
I know.
He said, his thumb gently caressing the back of her hand.
I know how much your faith means to you. But can't you see that there's room for both? For love and for God.
Lucia felt the weight of his words, the truth that resonated deep within her. She had always been taught that her devotion to the church was absolute, that there could be no room for earthly desires. But as she stood there, gazing into Damien's eyes, she realized that her heart had already opened to the possibility of something more.
I'm so confused.
Lucia admitted, her voice trembling.
I've never felt this way before. I've never wanted anything more than to serve the Lord, but now I'm not sure.
Damien reached up, gently cupping her face in his hands.
Then let me help you, Lucia. Let me show you that there's a way to have both. That you don't have to choose between your faith and your heart.
Lucia felt the heat of his touch, the tenderness in his gaze. She knew she should pull away, to retreat to the safety of the church, but in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she found herself leaning into his embrace, her forehead resting against his. They stood there, frozen in time, their forbidden longing palpable in the air around them. Lucia could feel the weight of her vows, the responsibility she had taken on, but in Damien's arms, she felt a sense of peace, a connection that transcended the boundaries of her faith. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, Lucia and Damien shared a moment of unspoken understanding. They knew that what they felt was wrong, that it went against everything Lucia had dedicated her life to, but in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. Slowly, reluctantly, Lucia pulled away, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret.
I can't, Damien. I just can't.
Damien nodded, his expression a bittersweet reflection of her own.
I know. I know, Lucia. But promise me one thing, promise me that you'll keep searching, that you'll find a way to reconcile your faith and your heart.
Lucia felt a tear slip down her cheek as she gazed up at him.
I promise.
She whispered, her voice barely audible. With a heavy heart, Lucia turned and made her way back to the church, her footsteps heavy and her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As she stepped through the doors, she knew that her life would never be the same, that the forbidden longing she shared with Damien had forever changed her. The decision. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of blooming wildflowers. Sister Lucia stood outside the ancient stone church, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she knew she must make. The flickering candlelight from the sanctuary cast a warm glow on her face, illuminating the conflict etched in her features. Damien emerged from the shadows, his footsteps soft against the gravel path. Their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Lucia felt her pulse quicken, the familiar pull of his presence stirring emotions she had tried so hard to suppress.
You came.
Damien said, his voice low and laced with a hint of hope. Lucia nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her.
I had to, Damien. There are things we need to discuss.
He moved closer, his gaze searching her face.
I know what you're going to say, Lucia. But please, just hear me out.
Lucia raised a hand, silencing him gently.
I've thought about this, Damien. Long and hard. And I've come to a decision.
Damien's expression shifted, the vulnerability in his eyes betraying his usually guarded demeanor.
Whatever it is, I'm willing to fight for us. For what we have.
Lucia felt a pang of sorrow in her heart.
That's just it, Damien. We can't have an U.S. I'm a nun, bound by vows that I cannot break. No matter how much I...
Her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat. Damien reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against her hand.
Don't say it, Lucia. Please, don't say it.
Tears glistened in Lucia's eyes as she looked up at him.
I love you, Damien. But I love God more. My faith, my devotion, it's a part of who I am. I can't abandon that, no matter how much it hurts.
Damien's jaw tightened, and Lucia could see the conflict raging within him.
So, this is it. You're choosing the church over me.
Lucia nodded, her heart breaking.
I'm so sorry, Damien. I wish things could be different, but I have to stay true to myself. To my vows.
Damien turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat.
I understand.
He paused, then looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation.
But know this, Lucia, I will never stop loving you. No matter what.
Lucia reached out, her fingers grazing his arm.
And I will always cherish the time we had together, Damien. But we must go our separate ways now.
They stood in silence, the weight of their decision palpable in the air. Lucia could feel her heart breaking, but she knew this was the path she had to take. Damien's presence had awakened a part of her she never knew existed, but her commitment to her faith was unbreakable. After a long moment, Damien stepped forward and gently cupped Lucia's face in his hands.
Promise me one thing, Lucia. Promise me that you'll find a way to be happy. Even if it's not with me.
Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks.
I promise, Damien. And I hope you find the peace and redemption you've been seeking.
Damien leaned in and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead.
Goodbye, Lucia. May God be with you.
He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Lucia watched him go, her heart aching with the finality of their farewell. She knew that this was the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. Alone in the shadows, Lucia knelt before the church, her hands clasped in prayer.
Lord, guide me in this path I have chosen. Help me find the strength to honor my vows, even as my heart yearns for something more. Show me the way to reconcile my love for you with the love I feel for Damien.
The flickering candlelight cast a warm glow, and Lucia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that her journey would not be an easy one, but she was determined to find a way to balance her faith and her heart's desires. With a renewed sense of purpose, she rose and made her way back into the church, her steps steady and her resolve unwavering. As she stepped into the sanctuary, Lucia couldn't help but glance back at the path Damien had taken. She whispered a silent prayer for his well-being, knowing that their paths had diverged but their connection would forever remain a part of her. With a deep breath, she turned her attention to the altar, ready to continue her devotion to God, even as a part of her heart would always belong to Damien. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.